Hello all, this is Joel again, your instructor, and we're going to be going through chapter 2 today. So this chapter actually filled with a lot of data. At the end of the chapter, I'm going to show you how to go to Fred and maybe update it. Textbook stops in 2018. Looks like PowerPoints were made a little before the last printing of this textbook. So like 2016, 2017 is when the data gives out. Much of this data can be updated by just going to one single website. Might not be a perfect match, but at least gives you an idea. And also it'll give you an introduction to where to find data in the future on your own for any projects or anything you need to do for this class or others. So without much ado, we're going to skip over the learning objectives. You guys can read those on your own, is what it is. So just start with some quotes. Yeah, is what it is. Anyway, so what are we going to discuss in this chapter? We're going to look at indices, nominal versus real values. I'm just going to tell you nominal is today's prices. Real values are adjusted for inflation. So real values are always with reference to some particular date and time period. We're also going to look at what is the food and fiber industry, the changing complexion or complexity of production agricultural, look at physical structures, productivity, profitability, financial structure, and then we'll look at the sectors within the food and fiber industry as well, to just kind of clarify those for you. Look at value-added process and what people do in that space. So food and fiber industry consists of those business entities that are involved in one fashion or another with the supply of food and fiber to consumers. So everything you see in this picture, fisheries, we could talk about forestry products and lumber and timber, can talk about crop production, row crop production, boutique production, in terms of tomatoes, talk about tropical fruits, cocoa, talk about large scale industry and small scale. So everything from small farmers and backyarders that sell at produce stands and farmers markets or neighborhood groups to large scale commercial ag production and even international ag production and distribution, right? All that's in this space. So from the food and fiber industry, we have the farm input supply sector. So when we're looking at that, we think about companies like John Deere or Ralston Purina. So these are the companies that supply the inputs. We can also think about our seed producers and our chemical manufacturers. So we can think about Dow Chemical and some of those other spaces, ADM, Archer Daniels, Midlands. You can think about the farm sector. So these are the people buying those inputs, buying the equipment, buying the seeds, doing everything in terms of actually producing the primary product for sale that's unprocessed, right? So people don't just eat a cow, right? They eat the pieces of the cow. People oftentimes, even with fruits or vegetables, don't eat the actual fruit or vegetable without some processing. But for many of them, we don't process. But the grain's definitely processed, right? And then we're looking at our processing and manufacturing sector. So here we're looking at Tyson Foods, which a little bit of hard one there because Tyson does, most of their farms are contract, but I believe they actually have some independent. No, I think it's all contracted out anyway. Del Monte, Swift, right? So these are the groups that take the produce, take the goods from the farm sector and make it so that it's sellable to the wholesale and retail sector. And so there we're looking at our Cisco, our Kroger, Heb. I don't know where Heb's located, but for us out here, maybe Safeway we think about. And then it all ends up with the consumer for us. So 1 out of every 6 jobs in this country is tied to the food and fiber industry. That's roughly been consistent for a while now, but it used to be a substantially higher number of jobs, right? As we've mechanized farming and farm production, and even the distribution chain, we need less workers tied to it. So fewer and fewer workers are involved in food and fiber industry over time than was historically needed. But for a while now, we've been pretty steady state, really since the 70s. The industry is responsible for roughly 12 to 15% of GDP. That's been pretty consistent over time as well. So we can look at food and fiber industry, and you see all of this data runs up to 2016-ish. You can see it's 2016 preliminary. Later on, I'm going to actually show you through Fred some of these, the net farm income, for example. Value crop production, we don't quite track that, but I'll show you how to find that as well. But what we can see is there's highly variable but with an upside bias over time, right? So, but these numbers do fluctuate widely on how much is able to be produced. And those are based upon lots of different constraints, right? So weather and disease being the two big factors that drive the ability to produce more, right? But if we look at this data going back further, I'm going to actually scroll over to a screen you guys aren't looking at just so I can see. But if we look at net farm income, for example, over a long period of time since 1967, where the data starts, through to today in 2021, where the latest data is January 1st, 2021, what can see is a general upward bias, but the swings can be quite dramatic. So you can end up with a 50% reduction in the value of farm income, with just in a 2-year swing. And we'll look at that when we're on Fred later at the end of the PowerPoint. So what's an index? An index is just a benchmark comparison from a fixed point of reference or a benchmark. So when we say that there's an index, almost always that index is tied to a particular year. We tend to think about even or decade years or every 5 years. So you'll see data a lot of times with an index of 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015. But technically, your index can be to any year. And so when you look at an index, it's important to see where that's going to be. The index just sets the fixed point so that we're controlling for inflation and says, let's just take the year 2000. That's where we're at 100. Anything lower than 100 is greater. Anything less than 100 is less, right? So with an index, economists can more easily describe how much an item has increased or decreased relative to the benchmark or the base period of time period. Okay, so if we have the 1990 as the base year in this example, then what we find is that the price index and the output index for the base year are always going to be set to 1. If we multiply that by 100, some textbooks or some indices will actually be out of 100, right? So it's out of 1 or 100. It's just a multiplicative factor. Normally, indices are printed out based off of 100. Your textbook's a little bit odd here doing it that way. And so what we can see is that the annual apple production for 1,000 short tons was 48.28 in 1990, and the price was 0.719. What we're going to do, though, with an index normally is we're going to really look at the change. And so if we want to look at the change in production, we can say that there was a 6.9% increase, that 1.069. That's why indices are nice. You can just take that and you can easily calculate the percentage change. So from 1990 to 97, the apple production grew by 6.9%. But when we factor into the price versus the production, we end up finding that there was a 26.1% change in the price-adjusted price indices, right? So looking at that 1.261 level, right? So that price change constituted a lot of the change in the price index for apples, but the production didn't change as much, right? So it was really prices driving that price index. Is what it is. Okay, so we've got 1990. This is just an example. And what they're doing is they're saying, look, if you look at that 1.069, that's just equal to the 5162 divided by the 4828, and that gives you your 6.9% change, right? So it's actually how we calculate a percentage change. We'll get into that later in the semester. Right now, we're just kind of really wanting to see the data and how things are measured in the economy. But we can, later we'll look at how to calculate percentage change if you didn't learn that in a math class prior. Nothing too big. Okay. So on the price side, they're doing the math again to show that it was 26.1% higher. As I said, the big thing I want to point out, it's easier to just look at the index and go from 1 to 1.261 than to calculate what happened by looking at the change in price, the percentage change in price. Just an FYI. Okay. So the prices paid and received, this is the all farm annual average index by year for the United States. And so what we're looking at, this is the amount paid versus the amount received. And so what we see is a general upward bias. And what we see is that there's a bigger gap between the amount that's paid for the items versus what farmers receive. That gap represents, I don't want to put it this way, but farmers losing value. It really represents the value of the middle person in the economy, I guess is one way of thinking about it. I perhaps need to think of a different way of thinking about this one for you. So let me think about it. I don't want to screw it up more, but we'll go on anyway. So here's the data that represents that graph, and we can see just for milk production and our output index versus the price index over time. And so we're looking at that relationship between output and prices. And what we see is milk production since 1995 has definitely gone up. In fact, goes up almost every year. See 2000, 2001, a slight decline. But otherwise, we're seeing a general upward bias in milk production. Little dip in 08 to 09. And yeah, everything else is up and away. And then when we look at prices, we're going to see something a little bit more variable, right? Where prices are going up and down, up and down. So price goes up, price goes down, price goes up, price goes down, price goes down, up, down, down, right? And so prices in terms of milk are much more variable than the production level. We'll see this over time. We would expect as technological adaptation and growth happens, that output does go up over time. What's interesting though is that even when price collapses, you don't see the big diminishing, right, of what's happening. So if we go to that data point, where was I looking? Where we end up in 2001 at 14.97, 2002, 12.11, 12.52. What we can see here is that because price is low, what's really happening to our output? Is there an incentive for producers when price is going lower or staying low to produce more? No. We don't see that drive happen until prices go up and then they stay up a little bit, and then that happens. But by and large, what we see is that producers are responsive to price on a lag basis, right? Meaning the price changes and then people change their production decisions based upon the price that they saw. But it's not perfect because a lot of those things are seen ex post. So when we compare nominal to real values, nominal just means that there's no adjustment for inflation. The values are just the values. So if you receive 97 cents a pound and you produce 100, then you've got $97 of production, right? Real values mean that we're going to hold the price constant over time, and that's going to give us our real value. Another way to calculate real value is to just take the nominal value and divide by the price index, and that's going to give us our real value as well. So nominal and real expenditures for food eaten away from home. And so this is when we're eating out. And so what you can see, we're using the CPI of 82 to 84 as a 1, right? So we don't actually have that year, but it's the average of the bases over those years. And so we've got our nominal expenditures for food eaten away from home going up over time. In fact, from 80 to 95, it more than doubles. And then what we can see is the consumer price index being changed. So how much people are spending is going up, and then also the real expenditures in billions of dollars, how much people are actually spending based upon those inflation adjusted norms, right? And so what we can see is when we remove the inflation in 1985, instead of having a doubling from 1980, we actually see prices only going up about a third, right? Not quite a third, but let's just call it a third over that time period. So is what it is. Okay, so here we've got more data. The CPI was 56.9% higher in 95 than it was in the 82 to 84 period. And that's because CPI is going to be looking at the impact of inflation, right? We're allowing those prices to change. And we're not looking at real production, right? Holding those dollars constant over time. So that real production in the last line is just holding it constant. So the increasing CPI eroded the purchasing power of the dollar. And we're just seeing that in that number. And what we're saying is, look, if the dollar had stayed consistent at its pricing in the 82 to 84 period, then we would have expected to have only paid $198.437 billion instead of the $302 billion that people actually paid, right? And so we're factoring in that higher cost of expenditure from the 82 to 84 period where we're at 1, right? So here's some real expenditures for gasoline, how much people are actually spending for this product. And so what we can see is that really the all-time high came in just before the great financial crisis, and that only beat out the highs from the early 80s by a little bit, right? That early 80 high on the far left over here was really like 370, probably 370 a gallon for gasoline. And we didn't hit that again until 2004. So it took us almost a little over 20 years to get back to the prices. And then you can see after that great financial crisis, gasoline prices collapse again, and then they've gone up in recent times. And right now, when you adjust for inflation, we're right about this area still. Now in California, we see higher prices, but that's a function of other things. This graph is not allowed, this is the wholesale price of gasoline, not the price of gasoline with taxes and at the retail level that you and I see. So anyway, just by way of example, in 2008, when I was driving, the price of gasoline at that time period was in California was, I want to say $5.50 a gallon. Although in that time period, I was actually on a road trip up in Mendocino County, and I was in a little town called Fort Bragg, and accidentally stopped at a gas station and was paying $9 a gallon for gasoline. So just give you an idea. But real expenditures for gasoline, very variable over time. And what you can see is that price of gas, even though it's been lower, is kind of consistent across time, right? So there's a lot of volatility or variability, but the actual price, if you control for those down periods, is actually fairly consistent. So is what it is. So here's an outline of the food and fiber system. So we've got our farm input supply sector. They put in the inputs and supply them to farmers. We're looking at seeds, chemical stocks, that's going to be fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. We've got our farm sector. They raise the raw farm product and supply them to the manufacturers and processors. Then we have those manufacturers and processors that take something like wheat and make it into a finished grain product and mill it, or take chicken and process it, get rid of the feathers and the skin, and cut it up. The wholesale retail sector might do some more refining of the good, or might just distribute it to the consumer, and then the consumer is going to use that product for consumption. So the changing complexion of farming, we have physical structure. There's fewer farms, but they're larger size, right? And so we actually might have more land under tillage in the United States. In fact, I actually believe we do, but we have fewer farms representing that land amount, right? So if we think about the relationship between small and large size farms, I forget the actual number, but somewhere there's 4 or 5 states in the United States that actually have a constitutional provision in their state constitutions to limit farm size and to make farming small farm focused. Iowa and Vermont being 2 of the big states that come to mind with those types of farming requirements and farm size restrictions that are constitutionally in their books. In California, we were actually supposed to have small farms, but we're one of the largest large-scale farm producers in the country. And a lot of that is because of the relationship between agriculture and water, right? And so initially, a lot of the water and viaduct systems were put in place through the Federal Water Project, were put in place under the premise that California was going to have small family farms. The laws did not change to make that happen. And so the consolidation in California has been pretty intense over time. One of the industries I used to work in was Southern California dairy farm production. And you can look in the 1980s from the Chino Valley Basin, which includes like Banning and Beaumont off the 60, all the way up through Ontario, off the between the 10 and 60 and the Inland Empire. And there were 500-600 farms minimum, maybe up to 1,000 at one point in the 70s. Lots of dairy farms, lots of other crop production, right? But dairy farms was what I worked in. By the time I was working in that industry in the well, I guess that would be the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, we were down to only like 150 farms, and that number was collapsing further. A lot of what dominated that was not just technology and changes in production methods, but also legal constraints, right? So in California, because of air pollution controls, there's a problem in environmental pollution monitoring and also in environmental economics, where point source pollution is hard when you have lots of small farmers. So I want you to imagine if you're going to do a program where you control pollution at the emission of tailpipes, so every car on the road gets a smog check, that's much harder to enforce and maintain than pollution controls being enforced on the 10 to 20 manufacturers of cars, right? So as the government, I can go in and regulate 20 people better than I can regulate millions of people. And the same thing happens in farming. In Southern California in particular, there was some dust mitigation controls because of how dusty it is in the summer when the farmland would dry out, and then the dairy farms would dry out, and then you'd have basically, feces enriched dirt being blown in the wind across the desert, and it created a lot of health problems. So you can imagine people who live in the community. Well, let's be honest, anyone who's lived or been around a dairy farm or driven up or down the 5 knows that smell, and the smell was worse because there was so much pollution on the farms, right? So much excess feces. So one of the implementations was to make farmers remove the cattle feces from their yards. Southern California has no fertilizer producers, so all of that crap needed to be shipped either north of the Grapevine, where was fertilizer production in Bakersfield area, Tulare, or head out to Arizona and or Nevada. I believe it was Arizona, where there was some fertilizer production there as well. Shipping crap is really expensive, right? And in this sense, we actually mean crap, right? The poop from the cows. And so the way Southern California Air Resources Board put in place the regulation in the early 2000s was they were requiring all farmers twice a year to remove all cow feces from their yards. So they had to scrape down the soil, put it into a truck, and then ship it out of that Chino Valley Basin into another state or north of the Grapevine. That was very cost prohibitive. And you can imagine if you're a small farm, you don't have a full load, but the bigger farmers don't have an incentive to let you dump your crap on top of their crap. And so it was driving up the cost structure for small farms. Large farmers were better able to handle it. Large farmers were more likely to have their own truck to do the hauling, right? And their employees that could do it. Small farm needed to contract that out. That's one unique way in California, but there's lots of ways where large farms have been small farms have been broken down in large farms. Another big drag, and we don't think about it a lot in California, but is really the price of residential and commercial real estate. And so in Southern California, as things became more impacted, it became more and more difficult to justify the usage of land for agricultural goods, right? So agricultural goods have lots of value, but to be blunt, if you can sell an acre of ag land for $1 million, but you can sell each quarter acre for $1 million to a real estate developer, you're the owner of the land, would you rather have 4 million or 1 million? And so you're a farmer, you're looking to sell out, you've got people knocking on your door from developers to local governments, and they're saying, hey, we'll give you money, sell us your land. It becomes harder and harder to resist that money, to resist that payout, right? So alternative uses for land actually drives larger farms, right? Because larger farms gain what economists call economies of scale, right? Benefits from being large. You get to use equipment more efficiently and better structured. You can do less and more outsourcing depending on your needs. So you have more flexibility. So the physical structure of farming's changed just based on that. Also changed because of the increasing use of capital or technology relative to labor. In the US, we're kind of midway on that process. You get to a country like Israel, I believe the last number I saw was like 85–90% of all Israeli agriculture is done by technology. So in the US, we still use field workers to produce picked tomatoes, for example. That doesn't have to be that way. It produces a better product to pick by hand, for certain, right? Think about a lot of crops are better hand picked. But in Israel, there's a shortage of labor, especially because of political constraints, a shortage of safe to use labor, shall we say. And so Israeli farmers a few decades ago launched on farming more and more through technological means. And so they are picking tomatoes with machine. Now, not as nice a product, but changes the cost structure, and that's changed the way farming happens. And so farm equipment and agricultural equipment, production equipment has definitely changed the way farms behave over time. And then we have increasing productivity or output per unit of input. And a lot of that's occurred since the 1970s because of something called the Green Revolution. And green isn't necessarily environmentally or health safe. It's the increasing usage of pesticides and herbicides. A lot of the modern pesticides and herbicides were really developed in the late 60s, early 70s. A lot of that came out of actually UC Riverside in particular, developing some of those tools and techniques. In more modern time period in the 90s and into 2000s through to today, we have the increasing usage of biotechnology changes and adaptation, right, and genetic modification of food sources to be more tolerant of different types of crop methods, or more drought tolerant, more herbicide or pesticide tolerant, more any other feature you could find desirable, for example. Change the complexion of the amino acid structure of the food itself has been done in rapeseed oil, for example, which converted canola, since rapeseed in its pure form kills humans and animals. So we can use lots of either traditional genetic engineering through hybridization, or more modern, post 1990s genetic engineering, where we're actually doing gene editing and splicing. So all these things have changed over time, the amount of productivity and how much we can produce. And then another local example, I was talking with one of the early farmers in the Diamond Almond Exchange. It's Diamond Almond, I believe. Yeah, anyway, he's a nut producer. He's actually a tech guy, retired from tech industry in his 40s, came out to the foothills and bought a bunch of land that no one saw as compatible for agricultural use because it was on a hillside. And he actually went in, instead of terracing that hillside, maybe how they did in Southern California, in a little town, I believe it's called Oak Grove, where they do apple production on terraces. What he did is he started planting almond orchards on hillsides, and he didn't terrace it. He just planted them into the hillsides and viewed it as kind of a nice, gentle sloping field. And he was one of the first farmers in this region to move away from using groundwater irrigation by using flood irrigation methods, and he moved to micro drip irrigation on his almond production. And he was telling me that because he's a computer engineer and a software engineer, he actually designed all of the software by hand using the soil hydrometers to tell how much water was in the soil and to custom adapt. And he had models that were saying his yields, and he ended up blowing his models out of the water. He ended up achieving almond yields that exceeded almost anyone else in the valley on the back of using technology and less workers, right? And he was able to produce in an environment that previously people thought wasn't very good for mass production of crops, right? So that changes as well. Other changes have come about from financial structure and performance. So the nominal net farm income growth in recent times allows farmers to have more bargaining strength in the financial markets. There's also bigger players coming in picture when you have these larger size farms. So I think it's not a surprise to say that a lot of farm land might not be owned by the farmers themselves. In recent years, I've noticed more and more of my friends who are getting into ranching, in particular out in Colorado, are just leasing land from wealthy people as opposed to doing anything else. But I actually have a colleague here at Delta College, her husband and their own farmland, but most of the farmland that they produce on isn't their own. They have, I think they only have like 3,000 or 4,000 acres. I guess they've got like 3,000 acres, but her husband farms another 20,000 acres of lease land, right? And so there's been a greater percentage in recent years of leasing, which changes things. Declining debt use strengthens equity positions of farmers. Farmers' land values going up in California, for example, has meant that it's been easier to finance projects, right? The bank looks at that value of the land and says, well, worst comes to worst, we can recover this, right? And then recovering real estate values after sharp declines has been a big help, right? And that actually didn't change really for farmland in the aggregate in 2008 with the financial recession, the way we would have expected maybe prior to that. So some facts: number of farms is roughly 2.1 million. The peak was 6.8 million farms in 1935. So you can see that collapse. The average size of U.S. farm is between 400 and 500 acres today. It's closest to 440 acres. Since World War II, the average farm size has doubled. And I want you to think about that notion, right? The average size farm in the US is still 400 to 500 acres. But when you look in California, we don't see a lot of farmers in that 400 to 500 acre spot. I don't know the actual number. I haven't actually looked, but when I think about personal farmers, I know, we've got a good friend down in Merced. He's got 12,000 acres under management, for example, for himself. So, he's running 12,000. I know another individual, it's a conglomerate. They're running close to 100,000 acres in the South Valley. And it's all one mega corporate farm at that point. So is what it is. But in California, we do have some of the largest farm sizes in the country. When I'm from the East Coast, my grandfather was the last of the farmers on my side of the family who still farm their own land. We're from Bucks County, Montgomery County, so out towards Philadelphia. And farm size in Pennsylvania, we're farming we're in that average, right? Our family was in that average, close to 400, 500 acres. Few people with a little larger. But I had family from Vermont running farms at Maple Syrup Farm with only like 200 acres on a hillside. So a lot smaller farms. You get to California, farm size is just bigger. They say everything's bigger in Texas, but it's big in California too. So I don't know. Texas farms that I'm aware of are pretty big as well. A little different nature though. So trends in number of farms. This is where you can see the change across time. See where there's collapse. So I'd like to point out though that 2006 period. This is right before the Great Financial Crisis. All those expensive land values were driving down the number of farms. Now, this isn't that huge a change when you're thinking about it, 2.1 to 2.2 million, but it's pretty dramatic, right? And then the bounce back when the recession occurred. All that residential land that was purchased, quite a bit of it didn't get used and went back to ag usage. Okay, so just some more charts. Average farm size, 1990 to 2015, and this is the value per acre. And so what we can see is as the farm sizes increase, this is once again that story of economies of scale, larger farm, more efficient operation, more output per acre. As your farm size increases, you actually end up seeing that, that growth, right? So even though we saw that dip in 2005 to 2006, really on our value per acre, it was just a flat line there. And then as farm size increased again, we just went up and jumped in how much value per acre we get. Oh, let me take a breath, just a second. So this is where I normally ask questions, so I can take a breath and grab a drink, but we are doing this by myself. So anyway, we've got the share of the 50,000 largest farms which is 2% of the farms, is 50% of total sales. I want you to think about that. Half of all ag sales come from only 2% of the farms. This is not uncommon, right? When we look at the general economy, non-farm sector with small businesses, most business in this country, I think the number is like 98% of business comes from 5% of companies in terms of dollar value. So most farms, most small businesses are small operations that are just there to benefit the person, right, in a small way. So 56% of US farms have sales of less than $10,000. These are not what you would call the only usage of money for these operations. But some of these farms, when we're looking in the IRS data, might be, I'm a landowner. I'll give an example. My father owns a lot of forestry land, right? In Washington's upper Washington and Canada. He actually owns in Washington and Canada. He owns a bunch in Shasta County and also up in Trinity County. In California, he also owns a bunch of Tennessee farmland, but that's a different story. So when we're looking at his timberland, he's got probably 200 acres of timberland. And every couple of years, he lets the logging companies come on and selectively log his timber to kind of control the growth, right? And to control forest fire mitigation. He gets paid for that, right? As opposed to paying someone to cut down his trees. He gets paid to cut down the trees since his trees are valuable. But I can tell you, I've seen his books. My dad doesn't make very much. He'd be in that less than 10,000. average per year. So maybe in the 1 year, if he had all of his land done at once, he might make more than 10,000. But most years he's getting small checks for the couple hundred trees they chop down. So is what it is. The concentration of production may be more of a critical issue than the decline in the number of farms. 10% of U.S. farms account for 75% of all the production, right? So, and the number of farms has been steady for the last 20 years, between 2 and 2.2 million in the U.S. Okay. U.S. farms tend to be more specialized rather than diversified. Most farmers produce one thing or two things on their farm. They don't tend to produce a lot of things. A lot of farmers are engaged in monocrop production as well. So I have some friends up in Nebraska. They raise either corn or soy. That's pretty much all they do. They'll swap back and forth between those two items. I have some friends in hog production out towards Illinois. He only does hogs. He doesn't do anything else. And then my friend in Merced County, his family started in hogs. They ran hogs all the way through to the 1960s. They switched to cattle from 1960s through to the 2008 period. And around 2008, they switched over actually to walnut and wheat production in the valley, right? Which I never think of California as being a large wheat production area, but there was a demand, we might talk about later in the semester, but a demand from a large government purchaser. And so they're the single producer for wheat for a government entity. So 3/4 of the farms with sales of greater than 500,000 produce no more than 3 commodities. So what that's telling us is the larger your farm, the less likely you are to be diverse in your production method. 60% of all farms are comprised of retired operators and operators who also work off the farm. So, most people engaged in farming or owning the farms are farmers themselves. What that means is 40% of farmers, though, farmland is comprised of people who don't have a relationship to farming, right? So there we're thinking about the wealthy person. Maybe you guys see news articles. Bill Gates, not known as a farmer, but owns, I think, currently the most amount of privately held ag land in the United States, right? He's the single largest holder. So a lot of very wealthy people started purchasing ag land. And they're not going to necessarily do the farming. They're just going to lease that land out more often than not. The average age of farm operator in the mid-50s is in the mid-50s. In 1940, it was 48, right? So this actually, one of the things that's been identified as problematic is, because I've seen some recent data where it's actually worse. Most farmers now are in their upper 50s to low 60s. And so what that means is a lot of younger people are finding it hard to get into agriculture and production because really it's that sheer cost. I mean, I want you to think about buying 500 acres in the Central Valley of farmland versus being my friend who has 12,000 acres, right? 500 acres would be expensive. 12,000 acres, I did the back of the envelope amount based on the average price of ag land sold in Merced County. That's $260 million in farm cost. Very few individuals would be able to pay $250 million for ag land in the modern era, right? When I look at my family, our farmland came through historical agreement. Let's be honest, it was stolen from someone, I'm sure, when people came over. And so they settled in the Northeast, they farmed that land. They never had to pay the actual cost of the farmland itself, right? And so one of the big challenges to getting into farming, if you're not already in it, is coming up with the capital to achieve that goal, right? And so some people, my daughter's fiance, his family, he wanted to be a rancher and he worked for a ranch. And the ranch he worked for, the man had been in cattle ranching his whole life and had never actually owned the land that he farmed or he ranched on. He had spent his whole life, and this is a gentleman in his 60s, leasing as a lease operator. So we have corporate farms versus family farms. Family-owned farms are not losing their share of U.S. agriculture to non-farm corporations. U.S. farms are mostly organized as individual operations. Farms are organized as partnerships, are about 5% of U.S. farms, and farms organized as corporations are another 3%, right? So partnerships and corporations account for 40% of the value of production. So let's put that in perspective. This is what we said before. Large farms produce more of the value of crop production. So in this case, 8% of the production comes through, 8% of farms account for 40% of the production by this method. Over the past 40 years, farmers have become less dependent upon terminal markets and the spot pricing. It's a good thing. Roughly 10% of farms today rely on production marketing contracts, and these farms account for 52% of agricultural production. So when we think about this, what's a contract farm? So I have a friend who was a chicken farmer in Merced County, not my friend with 12,000 acres. He's a much smaller farmer. But anyway, he ran a farm that did chicken production for a long period of time. He was approached by a company that is, and I forget the name of the company, but he was approached by a company that is the producer for all of the chicken, or sorry, the turkeys that end up at Whole Foods nationwide. And so they approached him and they said, how would you like to become a producer for us? And they put him under contract. And one of the things he told me he liked was when he became a contract farmer, he got a regular paycheck. If the turkeys got sick and died, he still got paid. They built in vacation time. He said for his whole career until he was in his 50s when he became a contract farmer, he had never had time off from being a chicken farmer. When he became a contract farmer, he was able to take vacation time, right? For the first time ever. They actually built it into his contract that these weeks out of the year, he didn't have any chickens on, or sorry, any turkeys on his premises, right? And so he was, he was tasked with one job and he did it well. So, there's benefits for why people do this, but you can also see that a lot of these contract farms make up a lot of agricultural production. 90% of US farms today have no production or marketing contracts. But once again, inverse of that is they only represent 48% of agricultural productive value, right? So, and remember, a lot of those farms are just small farms where they're just producing for themselves and a few friends or a farmer's market. Hey. Okay, so land, labor, capital, and materials. Capital refers to durable equipment and structures. It also can refer to the financial capital that's used to buy those things. When we talk about labor, we're talking about hired labor and self-employees or family members. We're also talking, when we talk about labor knowledge, right? How smart those laborers are, how trained they are. And then when we look at materials, we're tending to think about natural resources, such as the land, but we're also thinking about chemicals, which are derivatives of normally petrochemicals. And so they're derivatives of natural materials, right? And then we also look at materials and purchase services. So this is the index of farm inputs used in agricultural production from 48 to 2013. And so what we can see is 1980, the farm inputs used were expensive, right? Well, I'm kind of jumping the gun there, but anyway, we were at a high in terms of total farm inputs, but for the most part, we're spending between that 1 to 1.04 index level, which means that there's very little change in the amount of farm inputs used, except for that period in the 80s. For the most part, farm inputs have remained constant, while, by the way, farm outputs have gone up over time, if you go back to the old slides. Total farm input in the aggregate has remained stable since World War II. Labor's on the decline with materials offsetting that, right? So as farmers use less labor, they're paying more for materials, and so the amount they save on labor is just going somewhere else. Capital is being substituted for labor, and the use of capital inputs peaked in 1980 and has declined from 81 to 95 and been leveling off since then. So a way to think about that is we probably at that time were inputting a lot of brand new machinery that was very expensive. And now farmers are just rolling that machinery forward in time, right? As it decays, they buy a new piece, but they're not retrofitting farms wholesale all at once, right? You're making a decision as a farmer. I need this combine, I need this excavator, I need this tractor, I need XYZ based upon, or I need this tillage equipment or whatever, right? And so the farmers are making marginal decisions, but probably for some reason in history that I'm not aware of and isn't in your book, in 1980s, there was a big transformation in the way those inputs were used in the farm, and how we really were backing off from using labor at that time is and really mechanizing our farms. So capital is the blue line, labor is that red line, and you can see that massive decline in labor. It's been pretty consistent from the 50, really from 48 point forward. And that change in capital has kind of stayed exactly the same. And then our materials cost has just gone up over time, right? So definitely using more equipment. Okay, so productivity defined as output per unit of input has been dramatically increasing since World War II. Output's been on the rise primarily due to development and use of technology and biotechnology. And I talked about that prior, so I won't go on with that, but the technological revolution through pesticide, herbicide development, and then also some of the nitrogen fixation techniques and some of our knowledge about how to use these tools in farming, right? Water management has been huge in recent years in producing better yields, right? Learning how to grow more with less has been shockingly interesting. I mean, I want you to think weather's been topsy-turvy the last few years around the world, and yet somehow, even when you have an era of drought in California that's been persistent, the amount of production over time has gone up, and that really is about us getting smarter about water usage over time, and also biotechnology changes allowing for crops to grow that might not have grown in the past. The growth rates in livestock and crop output have been the same, have been about the same. The average growth rate's 2% per year. So U.S. farmers have widely adopted genetically engineered crops since '96. This hasn't been the case in other parts of the world, but we'll focus on the U.S. In particular. But if you go south of the border and over to Europe, there's been a lot less embracing of those genetically modified variants. India and China have been fairly adept at adopting them as well. So your examples are from the textbook. Soybeans and cotton are genetically engineered with herbicide-tolerant traits. Cotton and corn with insect-resistant traits. And as I said, there's some corn, looking at different varieties of corn, manufacturing corn seed that's more resistant to drought tolerance, for example. So this is your ag productivity index from 48 to 13. And what you can see is productivity has gone up over time, fairly substantial. 96 is R1, right? And so since 1996, we've gone up almost 18%. Pretty good. This is our farm output over time. Once again, it's gone up pretty good. But that output really does reflect with productivity, because from 1996 to 2015 or 2013 with this data, we've gone up almost 20% versus 18% change in productivity. So most of those output gains are from productivity changes, getting more with the same. Here's our output with livestock products. Here's output with crops. Notice crops are more variable. That's kind of interesting. Anyway, crops have more volatility, ups and downs than livestock production. You can imagine with that is really livestock production is a longer period of time of production more often than not always, depends on the livestock, versus looking at crop production. And maybe because of the dollar amount invested, livestock producers really can't afford the volatility. But, you know, I was also going to make an argument, maybe some of that crop volatility is related to pest and weather issues that really don't affect livestock to the same extent. The livestock producer might call a herd early, but more often than not, they're just going to pay up for that input price and still bring the product to market due to the sheer cost. Whereas if your pickers become too expensive, we've seen examples in Florida when picker prices get too high, tomato producers just don't pull tomatoes, right? They let them, they just till them under. So anyway, it's what it is. So what determines farm profitability? Cash receipts from farm marketing, government payments, other income from farm sources, that is equal to your gross farm. You deduct out your production expenses, that equals your nominal net farm income, and you divide that by the broadly based price deflator, which is basically your inflation rate, and you get your real net farm income. You're also going to want to know the equity or net worth, which is the value of real estate assets plus the value of non-real estate assets. That's your equipment and your buildings. This is plus the value of financial assets, any cash on hand or convertibles, And that's your assets, and you subtract out the debt or any money you owe to people, and that's your equity or net worth. So when we look at income and production expenses over time, what we can see is income has always been higher than production expenses in the aggregate, not necessarily for an individual farmer, right? So, but in the aggregate, farmers make more than they lose. Just you as an individual might lose money some years. And your production expenses have gone up, but not at the same rate as your income. In fact, in recent years, we've seen income going up faster than expenses, which has led to a bigger gap than we might have seen in the past. That gap is persistently been getting bigger over time, so I wouldn't bet that it's going to collapse back down, but it could. Net farm income versus real net farm income, 49 to 2014. And what we're looking here is that nominal has definitely outpaced the real. And that's what we would expect. And so when we control for inflation, look at that red line from 1983 going forward. We're making more, but we're not making dramatically more, right? When we control for inflation. So a lot of the change in those nominal values are the fact that people are paying more for the farm product now than they did in the past. So cash receipts from the farm sector and government payments. And so what you can see is government payments have been fairly flat since they've been introduced really in the 70s. They hit some spikes, but for most part, they've been flatlined, whereas cash receipts have gone up over time. And this is the value of real estate assets and non-real estate assets and financial assets. And so you can see that relationship, but most of the change has really been in the value of the real estate. Your equipment hasn't gone up in value as much as the real estate has changed. More data. So I'll let you guys read that, but that's the assets and liabilities. And you can see assets have climbed faster than liabilities. Most of that, though, remember, is from real estate value. So farms are worth more because the land's worth more. And this is the equity associated. So how much tangible equity is there? So nominal net farm income has ranged from 491 billion to 123 billion over the period from 11 to 14. And forecasts 58.3. Anyway, you guys can read this. It's just a wall of numbers. But nothing really important to point out here. The worst year in terms of lowest real net farm income was 1983. And if you learn anything about financial or economic history, you'll know early 80s, time of really high inflation. We think we've got high inflation now. It was quite a bit higher then, probably triple, at least triple what it is now, maybe a little higher, but at least triple in the US. And so, it makes sense that when you adjust for inflation, income would actually have been depressed, right? So the real value was going up, but the amount the farmer was actually making went down. So debt to asset ratios peaked in 85 at 22%. Currently, the debt to asset ratio is 12 to 13%. It's pretty friggin' low, is what it is. And then debt to equities fell the same pattern. Here's your major input expenditures, and what you can see is most of that goes to chemicals, fertilizer, and seeds, followed by feeds for livestock production. And by the time you get down to actually full fuel costs or taxes, it's the lowest part. Here's the restaurant industry share of food dollars in the US, and you can see that people are eating out more. Shouldn't be a surprise. In fact, I've seen this data go back to the 1980s. So if we think in 1980, the average family of 4 in the United States ate out less than 1 time per week. By 1995, the average family of 4 in the US was eating out 4 or 5 times a week, and that period of time represented what was it? 3 of the 4 meals were at McDonald's. So that's a little scary of a thought. So it is what it is. But we're definitely eating out more than we have in the past. A lot more. Okay, percentage of disposable personal income spent on food. And what we're seeing here is that people spend less on their budget. Kind of interesting note, and maybe this is a good discussion for the week, is or for this chapter, what do you think's happened now from 2014 to now? Are people spending more on food? I hope you say yes, but tell me why. Okay. This is an illustration of Engel's law, which we can get into later. So I don't want to talk about it now. And then this is the farm marketing bill. So what we're seeing here is of every dollar spent, 17.2 cents of every dollar spent on food goes to the farmer or the rancher. The rest of the money goes to the distributor and the marketing, so getting the food to the door. And this is the breakdown of how much the farmer receives for different products. And so what you can see is very little. I like this one. 6-pack of beer sells for $7. The farmer gets 6 cents of that. Most of that's what, hop and wheat value, right? So cereal, $4 a box, 5 cents goes to the farmer. Soda pop, 79 cents, 6 cents goes to the sugar farmer, right? Or corn producer, depends on the soda. So kind of interesting. Really the best ratio in this list, just from a quick eyeball, is the milk, right? Farmer gets $1.25 relative to $3.89 a gallon. So you're getting, what is that? Just under a third of the value. That's a big relative difference relative to other products. So anyway, as always, thank you for watching this. If you have any questions or want anything expanded upon, please feel free to ask, text, email, phone call to my cell phone number. And I can do up another video for you just on a particular topic. I'm assuming for chapter 1 and chapter 2, less needy, but as we get into chapter 3, 4, and 5, when we're talking about elasticities and curves and graphing, you might want more where I'm drawing and showing you how to do something. So once again, thank you for attending and have a good day.